Judith Teichman. She has written numerous books on transnational policy networks and crises in the region and on the political economy of Latin America. Her most recent book is called Social Forces and States, Poverty and Distributional Outcomes in South Korea, Chile, and Mexico.
In talking about the debt crisis, I am going to be drawing on research that research that I did back in the early 90s, most of which has been published in various places, and some of which some of you may well be familiar with. I'm going to talk specifically about Latin American transnational policy networks. These networks played a crucial role in propelling structural adjustment forward in Latin America in the wake of the 1980s debt crisis. These networks, at least in the major countries that I studied where radical market reform occurred, consisted of, on the one hand, senior client country finance officials, and on the other hand, World Bank personnel working in the Latin American and Caribbean section. However, the U.S. administration, particularly in some countries, played an important role from time to time, depending upon the circumstances. In the early years of the debt crisis, the main goal, as we heard, was not the economic recovery of Latin America, but rather preventing the collapse of the international financial system. And therefore, the goal was to ensure that highly indebted countries continued making payments on their debt in full. The problem initially then was not one defined as insolvency, and no consideration was given to the notion of debt reduction. This would come much later. The consequence was that countries were pressured to adopt harsh programs of austerity, and this was followed by structural adjustment or market reform programs, which of course involved drastic trade liberalization, in some cases of privatization, deregulation. There was no serious consideration given to, nor was there much concern about in this early period, the political and social impact of these reforms. The dominance of the process by a few big banks was an important ingredient in the disregard for debt relief and a no-growth strategy for Latin American countries. For much of the 80s, there was strong resistance from within countries to both austerity and market liberalizing reforms, coming from trade unions, civil society organizations, and from within the states of highly indebted countries, from both politicians and state bureaucrats. However, one of the things the debt crisis did was that it thrust to predominance those politicians and public officials who led the debt negotiation process. Minister of Finances and their technocratic teams. These were the people with graduate degrees from mainly U.S. universities, and many had in fact worked for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, or perhaps both. These were the people that were thrust to predominance when debt negotiations broke open on the political scene. They were strongly supportive of both austerity and deep market reform. Their perspective about what needed to be done in the area of economic policy emerged as the new conventional wisdom at the top echelons of political power. By the late 1980s, it had become clear to almost everyone that strict austerity was not working, and that Latin American countries would not recover if their economies were not allowed to grow. Also, it was apparent that more radical change in the form of drastic trade liberalization and wholesale privatization was necessary. It was at this point that the World Bank became an active participant in the process of economic reform in the region. It became considerably more involved at this point than the International Monetary Fund. The bank's heavy involvement in pushing structural adjustment forward stemmed largely from the fact that its officials were more flexible, more freewheeling, and more willing and able to take risks and push Latin American leaderships towards market reform. World Bank officials recognized that ordinary policy conditionality was not going to work, given the non-compliance with IMF targets that was rampant in the region. and that they were going to have to find other ways to bring about economic reforms in the region. Their change in strategy was facilitated by a change in World Bank organization in the early 1980s and the appointment of a new head of the Latin American and Caribbean section. After that point, Latin American and Caribbean bank officials began to pursue an informal strategy to win over country leaderships that involved ongoing quote-unquote conversations with country officials. They initiated conversations with finance ministry officials to discuss reforms in a wide variety of policy areas, including areas where they had no intention of making any loans. However, it's important to underline that country officials in finance ministries were by this time very grateful for the help in getting reforms underway. So this was a mutually agreed upon coming together of World Bank officials and senior level finance ministry officials at the time. The first discussions were on trade liberalization, and these were followed by discussions on public enterprise restructuring, and then about the sale of public companies. And later conversations were extended to a wide variety of policy areas, including labor flexibilization. From the bank's perspective, the objective of these discussions was to build up relationships of trust with country officials so that they could be persuaded to move forward with policy reform as quickly as possible. At the same time, country officials wanted ammunition and financial support to help them break down resistance to market reforms within the state. These transnational policy networks worked together on joint reports that were then circulated at country conferences and within the state to win over bureaucratic resistors to market reform. Relationships within transnational networks were easy to solidify because these bank and country officials shared similar views about how the economy operates. Many had attended universities together and became good friends in the process of policy discussion. As time went on, these networks worked out detailed reform plans that were then pressed forward. In some cases, the World Bank was extremely bold in its proactive reform campaigns. World Bank officials developed such a close relationship with Argentine officials, for example, that the Argentine side of the privatization network encouraged bank officials to meet with trade union leaders and with public enterprise directors to persuade them of policy reform, to persuade them of restructuring and then privatization. And World Bank officials did this on their own, went into the country, met with trade union leaders, and worked out deals with potential opponents, with, for example, trade union leaders, without country officials present. And these deals were what facilitated, lubricated the reform process going forward. Probably the main and most important feature of these policy networks is that they were closed and secretive in nature. Congress, heads of political parties, leaders of major interest groups were not involved in the discussions of policy reform. The only exception was powerful members of the private sector who client country officials often brought in, especially on the privatization issue. In the case of Argentina, they were brought in to help write the privatization bills. So they were very intimately involved. In fact, there was really no one in the top levels of governments at the time who thought widespread consultation or debate of these reforms was a good idea. It was widely believed that policy secrecy was the way to go because in this way the reforms could be implemented as fully and as quickly as possible. The main consultative activity, if you can call it that, was quote-unquote educating people who were perhaps just a little reluctant, i.e. people within the state. So, for example, reform in the Mexican agricultural sector involved bringing bureaucrats from the agricultural ministry to Washington and convincing them of ejido reform. This is privatization of Mexican communal lands. It did not involve conversations with leaders of farmer organizations, for example. In Mexico, the rapid dismantling of virtually all support programs for poor farmers in southern Mexico, in combination with the privatization of the ejido, is widely supported in the literature with a sharp rise in political mobilization, i.e. the rise and expansion of Zapatistas by the mid-1990s onwards. The point here is that exclusionary decision-making has political consequences. Perhaps the best example of hasty and unaccountable policy reform involved the privatization of state companies in Argentina. Here, intense pressure from bank officials who encouraged public companies to be sold off as quickly as possible bolstered the inclination of Argentine officials to pursue an unaccountable, secretive, and ultimately corrupt process. And the reason for this was that Argentine officials believed that doing it this way would get it done quickly and would satisfy World Bank demands. The initial neglect of the social impact of austerity and structural adjustment had well-known negative consequences, contributing to the rise of poverty and the sharp rise of inequality in most cases. The closed nature by which market reform policies were formulated and the lack of accountability contributed to the unequal distribution of the burdens of reform. This, in turn, often undermined regime legitimacy and eroded the public's faith in newly established and fragile democratic institutions. Eventually, as criticism gained momentum, regimes began to take measures to address the social deficit, as we know. But transnational policy networks established in the wake of the debt crisis proved to be extraordinarily resilient and now began to take on social issues. A good example of that is conditional cash transfer programs. These usually arose from the musings of finance ministry officials who wanted to find ways to keep social spending down. Good example is Progresa Oportunidades in the case of Mexico, which was hatched between finance ministry officials and officials within the Inter-American Development Bank. The debt crisis, with its negative social consequences, gave rise to political activism. Civil society organizations began to lobby, not just to lobby their home governments, but also the IFEs, due to the by now widely recognized fact that these organizations had been intimately involved in policies believed to contribute to poverty and inequality. By the 1990s, civil society lobbied heavily for involvement in anti-poverty policies. And in an odd turn of events, civil society lobbying of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank began to result in lending from these banks to Latin American governments to encourage them to consult civil society on their social policies. So what are the lessons in all of this for Europe? Well, I think one of the obvious ones is that austerity/reform packages need to fairly distribute the costs of adjustment. The problem with Latin American transnational policy networks in the aftermath of the debt crisis is that they were not accountable to the public of the country whose economy was being adjusted. Structural reforms need to involve strategies to create employment. This was not something that transnational policy networks, at least not the Latin American ones that I studied, thought about during the adjustment process. One of the reasons for this was their secretness and lack of accountability. Nobody knew what exactly they were doing. We know from the Latin American experience that if austerity and adjustment is too rapid and too deep, it will slow recovery, and it will generate political unrest and erode regime legitimacy. Recovery requires growth. Highly technocratic transnational policy networks, however, were driven by the desire to get deficits down and pay back the debt. They were not much concerned about the social and the political effects of what they were doing. In fact, in the cases I studied, the World Bank side of transnational networks was always urging client countries to disregard the social and political fallout of what they were doing and to push forward rapidly with reform. Policies, especially contentious ones, need to be debated publicly, not imposed from above, because there is a need to have a real public buy-in. This may take some time. It may mean that adjustment takes longer, but it is preferable than engendering widespread unrest and risking an eventual rejection of reform.